Hello and welcome to my presentation today. My name is Daniel Hanna and I'll be doing a presentation on the seismic interpretation of the Petrel field in the northern North Sea in 3D. So the aim of the presentation today is to create a better understanding of the Petrel field's gas reservoirs in particular, and there are 5 stages of the workflow that are outlined here, which include making a well-to-seismic tie, using a variety of 3D interpretation techniques to create the resulting surfaces of the Brent, the BCU, the gas-water contact and faults in 3D, before using a velocity model to complete a depth conversion and finally give a sort of analysis of the uncertainties that result from the findings. So if we have a look at the data set on the left, we can see the sort of in 3D we have the inlines and crosslines of the seismic field here, and there's actually a video playthrough that shows how these are loaded into Schlumberger Petrel and can be used. And we can see that we use wells 3122 and 3125, which are part of the seismic section, which are really useful for some further interpreting and actually will be covered in the seismic well tie section. However, before that, just a little bit of theory on the Petrel field. It's a supergiant oil and gas field in the northern North Sea on the Horder platform, and despite being divided between Petrel West and Petrel East, the Petrel field has a pressure connection between both sides, and furthermore to being a gas reservoir is also a potential CO2 storage opportunity. So, sort of 2 things to look out for in this presentation. So we're going to start off at looking at the well to seismic tie here, and sort of running from left to right. What we do here is we use an imported check shot survey to calibrate the sonic logs before QCing the sonic logs using a deterministic waveform, and this helps remove spurious frequencies within the data. And then beyond this we can use a sort of least squares method of QCing of the deterministic wavelet, and this helps us to create a synthetic seismogram for the use in the seismic imaging. And you'll see on the right hand side the synthetic reflectivity series that comes as a result. Moving on to the interpretation techniques, this is mostly going to cover how the tools we used, and then we'll get onto the surfaces a little bit after that. So here I've provided 3 videos. The top one here is the guided auto tracking, which it allows the user to sort of determine where they're going to draw their reflectors, but Petrel helps and makes sure that they're not going to overlap them between a sort of positive and negative reflectivity. The second version is the 3D seeded auto tracking, which is useful for quite consistent reflectors such as the seabed and the Horderland reflectors, and this creates a surface in real time. And then at the bottom here, which we might not be able to see, but this is the ghost tool, which allows you to sort of create an image that can go over some fault lines and help you determine the right reflector. Further to this, we also used the interpret faults tool, which here is shown in the 2D interpretation window and will also be developed into 3D. And I'm just showing here with the mouse how if you have an inline fault, it also translates to the crossline section, and I'm going to show you some faults that I did in 3D earlier, which we'll sort of go on to later, and I'll show more of the faulting in the surface, but it's just to get an idea of what they look like. And also on the 3D interpretation, here is the Brent interpretation, which I did a lot of surveying on. I used a spacing of 50 on the inline and cross lines in most parts, although I did increase this to 25 in addition to also using 2 different random lines, and this really helped me to get some of the interpretation I needed across faults, especially in the corner which has the highest depth, which you can just sort of see on the screen, entering the screen now. So moving on to the resulting faults, resulting surfaces and faults, we'll firstly have a look at the BCU, which is the unconformity above the Sonderfjord layer, and I'm just going to move this to 3D in a second too. So I was fairly happy with the result of the BCU. moving on from here, we did the gas-water contact, which can be sort of theorized by a flat line under the topography of the Sonnefield layer. So anywhere you see a flat line of the gas-water contact below where the Sonnefield might fall or it might be faulted, is an area you can suggest that the gas-water contact is going to be. So here's me doing it in the 2D interpretation window. And moving on, this is all of the locations in which I found the gas-water contact, and I drew a polygon around this to sort of help create a surface, which we can see here is going to be loaded into 3D. And this is the shape that was used. So here is the resulting gas-water contact, which we'll touch on a little bit later when we get to some of the outcomes of the findings of the presentation. Furthermore, here is the Brent surface, which I alluded to earlier, had a lot of interpretation, especially on the left-hand side there, which was very difficult to sort of ascertain, but I did manage through sort of some of the extents here. And creating a surface of this was of quite high sort of spec, because there was so much interpretation that Petrel did not have to sort of do too much inference itself, I suppose. And this was really useful in determining the faults that went through the whole section, which we'll get to in a second. So having a look at the faults here, we have some major faults around the section. I think we've got 6 in total, and I'm going to show these in 3D as well, but just a quick view in 2D there, and then here is sort of how they compare over the 3D section. So I'm just sort of showing them off with the mouse here, each one. These are important as well because they sort of determine where you're going to find the gas-water contact. So they're trapping gas from the Sonnefield layer. So these are, super useful to get sort of right, especially in the sort of bottom area of the screen right now. And furthermore, here is a combined resulting surface. So I built this up from the Brent. I've got the faults showing through, and I've just added the gas-water contact here. And then in a moment, I'm going to add the next layer, which is going to be Sonnefield. This is the Sonnefield layer. I feel like this could have had a bit more interpretation towards the sort of nearest most corner as it stands right now, which is definitely something we touch on later. And here is the BCU unconformity layer, which, it has, it's non-conformities. It has just sort of different heights and layers, 2 at a time at least, above the Sonnefield. And then we just added on the Hordaland and the seabed reflections at the top here. So we're going to move on to the depth conversion, which is really useful in ascertaining the gas-water contact and the size of the reservoir, for example. So a quick little bit on the velocity model. So we used 4 velocity models for depth conversion, and these were used using the sonic log of both wells, both separately and together, and these were QC'd before use as well. And they were all loaded into Petrel to assess the viability of each model. However, the layer cake model was deemed the most successful of the options, and this does make sense. It's a sort of highest order calculation of all of them, and we'll get once we get into the uncertainties, I'll sort of show you why, but this is really good for the most optimal reservoir sizing. So for a depth conversion, here is the Brent Sonnefield layer, and this represents the total reservoir of brine to gas content within the Sonnefield. There's an average thickness between about 400 meters and 575 meters depth between the Brent and Sonnefield layers, so it's a very sizable reservoir. And overleaf, we're actually going to see how much of the reservoir contains gas using the gas-water contact. Oops, that did not show. There we go. So this represents the gas content of the reservoir from the Sonnefield layer, and the average thickness resides between roughly 260 meters and 340 meters of depth between the gas-water contact and the Sonnefield layer. And depending on the residuals of the velocity model used, which we'll see later, this will assess the sort of upper and lower bounds for the gas contact. I'd also like to point out that it looks a little bit like a bird trying to eat a seed or something, or like a woodpecker, which I quite liked. And finally, we're going to move on to the analysis of the uncertainties we found. So starting off with just the surface interpretation, so there were some parts that were particularly difficult to interpret, especially the Brent reflector, for example. And actually at the bottom here I've shown an instance of me using the ghost tool, but not really finding too much success in being able to ascertain between the Sonny field and the Brent layers here. It's quite tricky to sort of understand across like one major fault. And this is made particularly difficult in the Brent layer because it's sort of close to the basement, either of the seismic section or the real seismic basement. So it's quite difficult to use all of the tools here. So we might have made some interpretations that were incorrect, but I did try to sort of tackle this to the best degree possible with more extensive interpretation of the Brent formation, and I used the 2D guided auto tracker rather than the seeded auto trackers for the deep reflectors. Furthermore, onto the velocity models, we had some sections that weren't exactly optimal for building a velocity model. So in well 3125, this was placed at a region where the BCU to Sonny field boundary was very thin, and we actually only had 2 data points for building a velocity model here. So the straight line fit between these values returned unrealistic values of K and V0, and as a result had to refit this manually, which could definitely result in some errors in the velocity model. And while well 3122 had more data points due to increased thickness, I wasn't still, I didn't totally trust the data that came out of it. So I think this was the cause of some particularly high residual values that I got when I loaded the velocity model 3 and 4 into Petrel. And as a result of these residuals, I did end up using the layer cake model, as I sort of alluded to earlier, because it had the lowest residuals here, which was best for estimating the size of the reservoir. So, do I put it here? No. So on the velocity model still, we saw that with the depth conversion with the gas water contact in the Sonny field, there was an average thickness of roughly 260 meters to 340 meters depth for the gas water contact and Sonny field layers. And we had the lowest residuals using the layer cake method of minus 3.63 and minus 17.79, which suggests that the depths of the gas water contact at Sonny field is accurate to depths of about plus or minus 17.79 meters, which sits in the range of 5 to 7% of the depth of the reservoir here. So you can make a pretty good estimation for how much how much gas is within this reservoir. And the good news of this is it suggests that this reservoir is both economically viable and low risk, which means that this is quite a successful exploration project in this regard. With respect to some further work, there are some more wells which are available in the data set, which might be more helpful in ascertaining some of the features here, although I didn't feel like the need to do this, and also I couldn't create a velocity model off them, so I didn't use them in this case. But of course, if they're useful and they have some qualms with economic interest, then it could definitely be something worth using. However, I think what really could have sort of been the best use of time is probably to do further interpretation of the Sonny field layer, just to ensure that the gas water contact has got the right depths in each part and the reservoirs of the right depths, and that would probably have the largest effect on the sort of outcome of the project. So I will conclude there, which with what seems hopefully a successful sort of exploration project here. I've left a sort of spinning version of all of my surfaces and my faults on the screen here, just for a sort of final recap. But otherwise, do feel free to email me at e22dh@leeds.ac.uk for any queries.